I took over my father's farm at the end of last summer, just a few weeks before the harvest moon. It felt strange to inherit land I never wanted, yet deep down I think he always meant for me to have it. Most of my childhood memories revolve around that patch of rolling fields and dense woodlands, the smell of fresh-tilled soil, the shrieks of cicadas in the late afternoon, the distant calls of owls at night. It should have felt comforting, like coming home, yet from the moment I arrived a subtle disquiet tugged at me, as if the land itself was wary of my return. The farmhouse was an old two-story building with peeling white paint and warped floorboards. The front porch sagged, and the ancient roof threatened to leak in every rain. But it was still sturdy enough to live in. On my first day, I unpacked only the essentials: a mattress, a few chairs, a second-hand kitchen table. Between the dust and the musty smell that lingered in each room, it took hours of cleaning just to make it habitable. By evening, exhausted, I crawled into bed with a single lamp glowing by my side. The wind outside carried the distant hush of rustling leaves and a low murmur I couldn't quite place, like the sigh of some slumbering animal. I expected my first night's sleep to be dreamless, a deep unconsciousness after so much physical labor. Instead, I dreamed of tall silhouettes moving in the fields, half hidden by moonlight shapes that seemed more deer than human, but also more human than deer. I couldn't see them clearly, only the faint glow of eyes and the glint of moonlight on branching antlers. I woke, heart pounding, uncertain if I had actually heard hooves on the porch, or if it was just the old house settling. The next morning I shrugged the dream off as a side effect of exhaustion and old childhood stories. I'd grown up hearing local legends about half-human, half-beast creatures roaming the woods. My father, in particular, had a vivid imagination, or so I believed. But as the days passed, that unsettled feeling didn't go away. Sometimes I caught fleeting movements in the corner of my eye while driving the tractor. Other times I found strange footprints near the tree line, hoofprints too large to belong to any ordinary deer. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was new here again, out of practice with rural life. The farmland was bound to have wildlife, and yet something felt off. Not long after I'd settled in, I started sorting through the boxes my father had stored in the barn's loft. Most contained mundane items, old tools, frayed ropes, spare machine parts. But one battered cardboard box contained notebooks labeled with my father's handwriting, scrawled uneven lines, as though he'd written in a hurry or under stress. I recognized some of them from my youth. He often carried a notepad around, jotting ideas for planting or tracking weather patterns. But these notebooks were different. They weren't about planting seasons or irrigation schedules. Their pages were filled with disturbing sketches of thin-limbed figures with antlers, half-formed faces, and small, childlike hands. They looked like nightmares given shape. Paragraph after paragraph described sightings at night, always near the harvest moon times when the nights were longest, or the sky brightest, or the crops at their fullest. The stories followed a pattern. Father claimed to see a herd of these creatures walking upright among the rows of corn or wandering at the edge of the woods. He called them the Stag's children. A passage in one notebook caught my eye. They appear during harvest, always at dusk or dawn. Never a full glimpse, only flickers between the corn stalks. They have antlers, or at least the adults do. The younger ones have nubs, like budding horns. They watch, but rarely approach unless invited. They leave gifts when they like you. They take when they don't. There were pages more of warnings, advice, and cryptic hints. If you see them, do not chase. Do not point your gun. They understand aggression. They also understand gratitude. Keep the offerings in sight at the edges of the fields. That's where they like them. It sounded insane, like some twisted folklore. Part of me wondered if my father had been consumed by paranoia or dementia in his later years. Yet as I read, my scalp prickled with recognition. It echoed the rumors I'd heard in childhood, whispered among neighbor kids about strange shapes in the cornfields, about bones found in odd arrangements. Back then I hadn't believed a word of it. Now, standing in that dusty barn loft, father's notes in hand, I felt a creeping dread that maybe there was something more to it. I nearly jumped when a gust of wind rattled the barn's loose siding. The sense that I was being watched, even here, gnawed at me. Ignoring the goosebumps on my arms, I gathered the notebooks and took them inside to study more carefully. If these creatures were real, if father truly believed in them, his notes might hold a clue on how to navigate this bizarre inheritance. Over the next few days, I dedicated my time to the fields. Harvest was fast approaching, and though Father's notes left me uneasy, I had practical responsibilities to attend to. The wheat was nearly ready, golden stalks swaying under the August sun, while the soybeans needed final inspection before the harvester arrived. During one sweltering afternoon, I paused to wipe my brow and check the horizon. That's when I noticed a single deer standing at the far edge of the field. At least it seemed like a deer tall with branching antlers, but something was odd about its posture. It stood too upright, front legs almost folded like arms, the head canted at a slight angle. The distance made it hard to be sure, but it felt like it was watching me. My heart thudded. I blinked, trying to clear the glare from my eyes. By the time I looked again, it was gone. A wave of unease swept through me, accompanied by an echo of Father's words. They watch, but rarely approach unless invited. That evening I revisited the notebooks. One particularly chilling line read, "They have no fear of men, only caution. If they sense hostility, they vanish. If they sense acceptance, they come closer." My father mentioned a tradition leaving some portion of the harvest in small offering baskets near the woods, a way to keep them appeased. Another line, "The old families in these parts know. They never harvest everything. They leave corners of the fields untouched for them." I recalled hearing how some farmers in the region would leave small, unharvested corners as a show of respect to wildlife or as an old folk superstition. I always thought it was either laziness or an outdated practice. Now it seemed deliberate. 2 nights later, the harvest moon rose large and orange over the horizon. Its light bathed the fields in a glowing haze. I stood on the porch, Father's notes in hand, wondering if I should attempt his offering. Part of me still resisted. This was nonsense. But my stomach churned with memory of that upright shape in the distance. Finally, I filled a small basket with vegetables from the garden corn, carrots, a few tomatoes, and carried it to the edge of the woods. I placed it on a stump near the fence, trying not to think too hard about how ridiculous I felt. Then I went back inside, locking the doors behind me. That night, I dreamed again of tall, antlered silhouettes crossing the yard, opening the porch door with quiet taps of elongated fingers, rummaging through rooms in search of me. Their eyes glowed with a strange luminescence, and their breath smelled like damp leaves. I woke in a cold sweat, half expecting them to loom at my bedside. The house was empty, but outside the window, a faint rustle of leaves told me I wasn't alone. Come morning, I ventured out to check the offering. The basket was gone, not just emptied, gone entirely. No obvious footprints, no signs of wildlife rummaging. I found only a faint line of bent grass leading deeper into the trees. Anxiety battled relief in my mind. Maybe my father's tales were real, and maybe the offering had been accepted. I hoped that was the end of it. For 2 or 3 days afterward, nothing particularly strange happened. I went about my farm chores, fixed the porch steps, and even drove into town for supplies. The uneasy feeling didn't vanish, but it dulled at the edges, letting me focus on daily life. Then, on the morning after the full harvest moon, I found a bundle on my porch. At first, I thought it was a pile of sticks or dried vines, but when I drew closer, an acrid scent of old blood and decay wafted up, making my stomach lurch. These weren't sticks, they were bones, deer bones to be precise, cleaned and bleached as though by sun and time, yet still streaked with red at the joints. They'd been arranged in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a child's drawing of a person. A skull at the top for a head, ribs forming a torso, smaller bones aligned to form arms and legs. I stared, heart pounding. Father's words echoed in my mind. They leave gifts when they like you. They take when they don't. Was this a gift or a warning? I backed away, unable to tear my gaze from the crude bone figure. My hands shook. Eventually, I found the courage to dispose of them, though I half wondered if that would be seen as an insult. I wrapped them in an old burlap sack and buried them at the back of the barn, uncertain what else to do. For the rest of the day, I was jumpy, any small sound making me flinch. The muffled clang of tools in the barn felt ominous. The wind in the trees seemed to sigh with disapproval. I regretted burying the bones so hastily. Perhaps I should have left them, or rearranged them, or performed some ritual I didn't understand. My father's notebooks might have said something about that, but I'd read them haphazardly. That evening, I pored over the pages again, searching for mention of bones. Near the back of one notebook, I found a line scrawled in heavier pencil. as if written under stress. If they present you with remains, do not discard them carelessly. Keep them close or burn them in a respectful fire. They are testing you. Too late. The bones were now rotting under a thin layer of dirt behind the barn, hardly a respectful resting place. My heart sank. Like clockwork, the nightmares resumed. Sleep brought me images of scuttling figures with branching antlers, their limbs bending at impossible angles. I saw them creeping through the windows, pressing elongated faces against the glass, glaring at me with black eyes. In one dream, I stood in the barn at midnight, gazing at rows of suspended deer skulls, each with a mouth that moved as if whispering in unison. I woke more exhausted than before I went to bed. My mind felt frayed, my nerves raw. Even the animals sensed my agitation. The few cows I kept seemed skittish, often lowing nervously at dusk. My dog, Toby, refused to leave the porch after sunset, whining if I tried to coax him into the yard. I told myself to get a grip, but every day brought new evidence that something wasn't right. I found half-eaten crops in the far fields, torn in a way that didn't match typical deer feeding. Pieces of corn husk were stacked in neat piles, as though arranged deliberately. Twigs woven into small, crude effigies hung from fence posts, swaying in the breeze. Once or twice I heard high-pitched chattering in the woods, like laughter or chanting. When I approached, it stopped. I'd always prided myself on being a rational person, but Father's notes hammered in my skull, pointing to a reality that defied reason. He wrote about the Stag's children, as if they were a separate tribe or clan living alongside us, revealing themselves only at certain times of year. They gave gifts if they were pleased, otherwise they took something in return: livestock, possessions, occasionally worse. He never explicitly wrote about them taking a human life, but the implications were there in ominous half-lines. The year-old man Ridley vanished, bones appeared in the orchard. Or, they don't always show mercy. One afternoon, determined to quell my growing panic, I decided to look for evidence-true physical proof that these creatures existed. I walked the perimeter of the property with Toby at my side, carrying a camera and a flashlight. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the fields. My breath felt tight as I neared the tree line, where Father's notes claimed they gathered. I found fresh tracks, elongated hoofprints with strange toe-like indentations. Some prints overlapped, forming a tangle of impressions that definitely weren't typical deer tracks. My scalp tingled. I snapped photographs with shaking hands. Further along, I discovered a small clearing amid the oaks, where the remains of a rudimentary fire pit lay. Around it stood several short wooden poles adorned with deer skulls. They smelled old, not fresh kills, perhaps trophies or ritual objects. A hush fell over the forest, and Toby began growling, hackles raised. My heart pounded so loudly I felt it in my temples. If these were the Stag's children, they weren't just mindless creatures. They had structures, totems, a sense of ceremony. Nothing about that knowledge comforted me. In fact, it frightened me more because it implied intent. I retreated, snapping a few more photos before hurrying home. Once inside, I locked every door and window, scanning the edges of the yard. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was constant. Night came swiftly, and I found myself cowering with Toby in the living room, the lights on. Sometime around midnight, I heard soft scratching near the back door, followed by a gentle rattle of the knob. Toby barked, but the noise ceased. We spent the rest of the night in tense silence. At dawn, I ventured outside. The farm felt unnaturally still. Even birdsong seemed absent. Part of me hoped to find nothing out of place, to believe I'd just had a paranoid hallucination. Instead, I saw the back door had been smeared with some dark, sticky substance in a pattern that looked like an upside-down handprint. I gagged, uncertain if it was animal blood or something else. Clearly, they had tried to enter or at least make a statement. Gritting my teeth, I rushed to Father's notebooks again, searching for how to respond. He'd written pages about keeping the peace with them. Offer them part of the harvest grain, vegetables, or anything grown from the land. Never hunt in the full moon. Do not fire guns or lay traps when the moon is bright. Respect their markers, leave them where found, do not dismantle. If they leave bones, treat them with reverence. Either keep them in a safe place or burn them with a prayer of thanks. I broke that fourth rule. I'd buried the bones in a hasty manner, with no respect. My father believed that was an insult. That knowledge spurred a cold terror in me. Were these nightly visitations punishments for my disrespect? I decided to try remedying the mistake. Taking a shovel, I went out back to unearth the sack of bones. My skin crawled at the thought of retrieving them. Yet, if Father was correct, I needed to do so properly. When I found the bones, they smelled worse than before, sticky with rot. I nearly vomited as I lifted them carefully from the earth. A sense of being watched pressed on me from all directions, though I saw no one in the yard. I placed the bones in a wooden crate and carried them to a clearing near the barn, where I built a small pyre with firewood. Muttering an awkward prayer I invented on the spot, I lit the pyre, stifling gags at the pungent smoke. As the flames licked the bones, a sudden gust of wind stirred the air. It carried a low, resonant sound like distant horns or a lamenting call. Goosebumps prickled my arms. Even Toby howled, a keening note of anxiety. I finished the burning, scattering the ashes in the field as respectfully as I could. By the time I was done, the sun had slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in ominous purples and reds. That night the wind stood still. The insects remained hushed. I sat on the porch, shotgun at my side, Toby curled up by my feet. Part of me wanted to flee, pack up the truck, and drive away from this cursed place. But something in Father's notes suggested running wouldn't help. They could follow their chosen target. Or perhaps the land was inescapably tied to our family. Father once wrote, "It's in our blood. We are part of their cycle." Around midnight I heard it, a faint rustling in the fields as though many legs brushed against the tall stalks. My heart pounded. Toby lifted his head, ears pricked. The rustling drew closer, weaving among the rows of crops. Then, emerging into the open, I saw silhouettes by moonlight tall, lean shapes with broad, branching antlers that caught the lunar glow. Some stood erect, others hunched, their long limbs swaying. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there were far more than I'd ever suspected, at least a dozen, likely more behind them. They paused at the edge of the yard, luminous eyes fixating on me. Even from that distance, I sensed their intelligence, a curiosity tinged with predatory wariness. Slowly I stood, hands trembling. My shotgun felt useless. It wouldn't help if they decided to attack. Father's notes had warned, guns provoke them, you can't outshoot them all. A single figure advanced, stepping into a shaft of moonlight. It was taller than the rest, with a crown of antlers that branched into multiple tines. Its face was partly in shadow, but I glimpsed a mouth too narrow and lips parted, revealing small, blunt teeth. It made no sound, only tilted its head, as though examining me. I remembered Father's note about gestures of peace. With painstaking slowness, I lowered my shotgun to the porch floor and raised my empty hands, palms out. My heart hammered so fiercely I wondered if they could hear it. The creature exhaled through flared nostrils, releasing a visible plume of breath in the night air. Behind it, the others shifted restlessly. Some turned their heads with quick, jerky movements, as though sniffing the wind. The leader extended one claw-tipped hand. A moonbeam revealed that it had only 3 long fingers and a thumb. My stomach twisted. That hand beckoned, summoning me forward into the yard. Adrenaline roared in my ears. Every cell in my body screamed to run, but I forced myself to descend the porch steps, step by trembling step. Toby stayed at the threshold, whining softly. I didn't blame him. Reaching the edge of the yard, I stopped a few yards from the antlered figure. Its eyes, reflective in the moonlight, surveyed me with an almost clinical intensity. Up close, I noticed patterns in its fur, yes. It had patches of short, tawny fur on its arms and shoulders. Around its face, the skin was hairless, taut. Ridges of bone lined its cheeks, merging with the antler base at the temples. A vile combination of human and deer features fused into a singular form. We stood like that for an eternity, one human, one stag man, locked in uneasy silence. Then, behind it, another stepped forward, smaller, perhaps female or a juvenile, with shorter antlers. It held something in its thin arms, a large bone, carved or etched with simple markings. The leader took the bone, turned it over, and extended it to me. I swallowed, mind racing. This was an offering, or a communication. Carefully, I reached out and accepted the bone. It felt warm, almost as if it had recently been part of a living body. The markings were crude lines that formed a shape reminiscent of a deer's head. My father's words returned. They leave gifts when they like you. Had my attempt to rectify the burial of bones somehow appeased them? Or was this a test? Unsure what else to do, I bowed my head slightly, whispering, "Thank you," though my voice quivered with fear. The creature's nostrils flared again. It gave a slow nod, then took a step backward. The rest of the herd, if that's what they were, parted in a silent wave as it turned and vanished into the darkness. One by one, they receded into the fields, their silhouettes dissolving under the moonlit horizon. In moments, only the rustle of crops remained. I stood there, clutching the bone, heart hammering. Gradually, Toby bounded up to my side, sniffing anxiously at my heels. The night air felt electric, charged with tension. I looked down at the bone in my hand, at the strange etchings. This was no random gift. It was a sign, a message. The following morning, the farm felt oddly peaceful. Birds sang again, and the fields glimmered with dew. I set the carved bone on the kitchen table, staring at it for hours as I drank coffee. My mind reeled with the knowledge that Father's notebooks were true. These creatures existed, and I had just communed with them in a kind of unspoken truce. Flipping through the notebooks again, I found a passage that seemed relevant. When they offer you carved bone, you stand at a crossroads. Reciprocate their gift or refuse it. If you accept, you bind yourself to a silent, understanding one that must be honored each harvest. Did this mean I was required to continue giving them offerings of crops, or that I was now under their protection or their scrutiny? Either way, I knew I couldn't simply ignore them. The next night, I prepared a more deliberate offering. A large basket filled with fresh corn, squash, and a portion of the wheat I'd harvested. At the same clearing by the woods, I lit a small lantern and set the basket beside it. I left the carved bone leaning against the basket in case that signaled a reciprocal gesture. Then I waited, though not directly in the clearing. Instead, I stood a short distance away, hidden behind a tree, Toby at my side to observe if they would come. Dusk settled, the moon rose again, and after an hour of tense waiting, I saw them. 4 shapes slipped out of the trees, their antlers gleaming. One, presumably the same leader from before, approached the basket. It knelt, picked up the bone, and pressed it against its chest as though acknowledging the offering. Then, with a wave of its hand, it led the others in taking small portions from the basket. They made no attempt to search for me. They seemed aware I was close but not threatening. My breath caught in awe mixed with dread. When they finished, they left the basket behind empty but undamaged. The leader paused to look in my direction, tilting its head. I felt that locked gaze even though we were dozens of yards apart. An understanding passed between us. I had done what was expected. For now, that would suffice. The following morning, the farm felt oddly peaceful. Birds sang again, and the fields glimmered with dew. I set the carved bone on the kitchen table, staring at it for hours as I drank coffee. My mind reeled with the knowledge that Father's notebooks were true. These creatures existed, and I had just communed with them in a kind of unspoken truce. Flipping through the notebooks again, I found a passage that seemed relevant. When they offer you carved bone, you stand at a crossroads. Reciprocate their gift or refuse it. If you accept, you bind yourself to a silent, understanding one that must be honored each harvest. Did this mean I was required to continue giving them offerings of crops, or that I was now under their protection or their scrutiny? Either way, I knew I couldn't simply ignore them. The next night, I prepared a more deliberate offering. A large basket filled with fresh corn, squash, and a portion of the wheat I'd harvested. At the same clearing by the woods, I lit a small lantern and set the basket beside it. I left the carved bone leaning against the basket in case that signaled a reciprocal gesture. Then I waited, though not directly in the clearing. Instead, I stood a short distance away, hidden behind a tree, Toby at my side to observe if they would come. Dusk settled, the moon rose again, and after an hour of tense waiting, I saw them. 4 shapes slipped out of the trees, their antlers gleaming. One, presumably the same leader from before, approached the basket. It knelt, picked up the bone, and pressed it against its chest as though acknowledging the offering. Then, with a wave of its hand, it led the others in taking small portions from the basket. They made no attempt to search for me. They seemed aware I was close but not threatening. My breath caught in awe mixed with dread. When they finished, they left the basket behind empty but undamaged. The leader paused to look in my direction, tilting its head. I felt that locked gaze even though we were dozens of yards apart. An understanding passed between us. I had done what was expected. For now, that would suffice. In the days that followed, life settled into an uneasy routine. I took care of the farm, and each evening I left a small portion of crops at the woodland clearing. The nightmares lessened, replaced by restless dreams of roving shadows that sometimes resolved into watchers at my window. I no longer woke in sheer terror, though a constant knot of anxiety remained coiled in my stomach. One afternoon I ventured into the barn's loft, searching for any final notes of my father's that might offer more insight. There, tucked behind a crate, I found a sealed envelope addressed to me. Inside lay a single sheet of paper in my father's shaky handwriting. "Son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and it falls to you to maintain the balance." I tried to keep it quiet, to protect you from this burden, but the land is old, and the creatures older still. They are watchers, caretakers, or devils, depending on who you ask. You cannot fight them in the usual sense. You must coexist, honor them in the harvest months, and they won't harm you or your livelihood. They'll guard your fields from outsiders, from thieves or predators. But never cross them. Never lie to them. Never break a deal made under the moon. If you do, they'll take more than you can imagine. Remember, they're not simply animals. They think, they judge, and they do not forgive easily. I'm sorry to have left you this. May you find a way to carry it. I sank onto an old hay bale, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. So this was why Father had become so withdrawn in his later years. He must have realized the magnitude of this unholy covenant. He likely never told me because he hoped the creatures would remain dormant or that the tradition would fade. But it hadn't. Now, it had fallen to me. For a while it seemed that my compliance with their rituals was enough. The Stag's children left no further ominous gifts on my porch. They seemed content to accept my nightly offerings, and in return, my crops thrived. The yields were excellent, with minimal damage from pests. No foxes snuck into the chicken coop, no coyotes harassed the livestock. If Father's claims were true, these creatures protected the land as long as we played our role. But as the harvest moon waned, something shifted. One night Toby went missing. He was there at dusk, then gone after I set out the offering. I searched everywhere around the house, the barn, the fields. I called his name until my throat ached, found no sign of him except for a few paw prints leading toward the woods. My heart sank. Toby had never wandered far before. He must have followed a scent or been spooked. Panicked, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured beyond the property line, calling Toby's name. The forest was eerily quiet. Eventually, I reached the clearing where I placed the offerings. My basket was knocked over, its contents strewn around. Splashes of red stained the grass. My gut clenched. I told myself it could be crushed tomatoes or spilt beet juice. Anything but what it looked like. Blood. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in the trees caught my eye. I turned, shining the flashlight, catching a glimpse of two reflective eyes low to the ground. "Toby," I whispered, stepping closer. The eyes blinked, shifting, uprising higher and higher until they were at chest level, attached to a lanky figure crowned with antlers. My lungs seized. This was not Toby. The creature hissed, revealing teeth too flat for a normal deer. I stumbled backward. Around me more shapes emerged, clacking antlers and snorting softly. One of them carried something in its hand, something that dangled limply. My eyes focused, and I realized it was Toby's collar. I found my way back to the farmhouse, clutching Toby's collar as if it were a life raft. My mind churned with grief and fury. I wanted revenge, but Father's notebooks were clear. Violence would be suicide. There were too many of them, too cunning. Even if I managed to kill one, the rest would exact a terrible price. In the depths of my despair, a desperate plan formed. My father wrote that the Stag's children respected exchange, a balancing of debts. They gave gifts. They took. Perhaps if I offered something of equal value, they might return Toby, or, at the very least, leave me in peace. But what could I trade? All night I agonized over it, rereading Father's final letter. Never break a deal made under the moon. Could I form a new deal? At sunrise, I loaded my truck and drove into the nearby town. I bought supplies for a ceremony of sorts: incense, candles, more feed for livestock. I wasn't sure how to replicate anything from Father's notes, but I had to try something. That evening I cleared a space near the barn, placing the carved bone I'd been gifted at the center. I arranged candles in a rough circle, lit them, and burned incense that smelled of pine and sage. It felt ridiculous, like an amateur witchcraft ritual. But Father had insisted they understood symbolic gestures. Kneeling in the circle, I invoked their presence, calling them forth. My voice trembled, but I spoke as firmly as I could. You took my dog. I beg for his return. If that can't be done, then let me offer something else for your favor. My labor, my harvest, my loyalty, anything but more bloodshed. Let's make peace. The sky above was starless, a deep velvet black. A breeze rustled the candles, making the flames dance. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, from beyond the circle of light, a chorus of strange clicks and whistles rose unmistakably, the voices of the Stag's children. My heart clenched. Several pairs of eyes glowed at the edge of darkness. The tall leader emerged, antlers seeming to scrape the night sky. Behind it, another carried a limp shape. My breath caught Toby's body. The shape was too large to be that of a small dog, though. As they drew closer, I realized it was a freshly killed deer. The smaller figure laid the deer carcass at the edge of the circle. The leader locked eyes with me, then gestured toward the deer as if to say, "Here is your offering, accept it." Confusion churned in my gut. Why present me with a dead deer? Was it a form of restitution? A way of saying, "We took your dog, so here is a life in return"? The twisted logic sickened me. I swallowed back bile and forced myself to remain calm. Perhaps this was their version of a peace settlement, a trade of life for life. I nodded slowly, unsure if they understood. I accept your offering," I managed to say, tears stinging my eyes. Toby was gone, replaced by a worthless corpse of a deer. But if it meant they wouldn't harm me further, maybe that was the best I could hope for. The leader stepped closer to the circle. Slowly it reached a clawed hand toward me. I froze, every muscle tense. Then, with deliberate care, it placed its palm against the carved bone on the ground, as if sealing an agreement. In the same motion, it looked at me, tilting its head, a silent question. I forced myself to mimic the gesture, resting my hand on the bone as well. A jolt of static-like energy prickled my palm, and a wave of dizziness washed through me. When I blinked, the creatures were already retreating, leaving the deer carcass behind. The leader lingered a moment, gave a single solemn nod, then vanished into the darkness. Days later, I buried Toby's collar behind the barn, near where I'd once buried the deer bones. I used the same small pyre to burn the deer carcass, offering its ashes to the wind. It felt symbolic, even if I didn't fully comprehend the significance. The nightmares that followed were sorrowful but lacked the vicious edge they once had. The harvest concluded soon after. I left corners of the field unharvested, abiding by Father's tradition. I also continued placing modest offerings near the woods, sometimes just a few ears of corn or a small bag of feed, hoping to maintain that fragile peace. My father's final note lingered in my mind. They do not forgive easily. If I made another mistake, I suspected the consequences would be far worse. Winter came and went with little incident. My nights were no longer marked by scratching at the doors or bone effigies on the porch, yet I sensed them out there, roaming the snow-laden trees, watching from the shadows. Sometimes I found fresh tracks circling the barn or a tuft of fur snagged on a fence. They never confronted me directly, but the presence was constant, a reminder of the uneasy pact sealed under the harvest moon. In the spring, I discovered a bizarre structure at the far edge of the property. 3 tall branches lashed together into a pyramid, topped by a single deer skull. Beneath it were scattered seeds, some of which I recognized as from my own storehouse. A gift or a demand? I wasn't sure, but I treated it with respect, leaving it intact. That night, I swore I saw a figure lurking at the tree line, its antlers outlined against the waning moon. It stood watch for a while, then disappeared. Now, nearly a year has passed. Another harvest moon is on the horizon. I've spent the warm months tending crops, making small offerings, and avoiding any challenge to the creature's domain. Despite the horrors I've witnessed, the farm is thriving. My yields are high. Neighbors remark on how my livestock remain remarkably healthy, but the cost hangs over me like a thundercloud. I still ache with guilt and grief over Toby, lost to a world I barely comprehend. Each night before I drift into uneasy sleep, I wonder if some new tragedy will befall me should I fail to meet the Stag's children's expectations. My father's words echo in my mind. They leave gifts when they like you. They take when they don't. I've learned the truth of that warning in the hardest way possible, and I've come to realize their gifts are as dangerous as their punishments. Accepting them means welcoming a connection to these ancient, unearthly beings, a bond that brings prosperity at the risk of unspeakable costs. I once considered fleeing, but I fear it's too late. The land is mine, the pact sealed. If I left, they might follow, or they might simply claim another rightful guardian of the family acreage. Perhaps my father tried running once, and that's why he came back. Perhaps these creatures hold our lineage in their grasp, generation after generation. So I remain, my life overshadowed by the watchers at the edge of the field. I carry the carved bone in my pocket during each harvest, a reminder of my agreement. At dusk, I place offerings near the woods. At night, I sometimes glimpse them in the corners of my vision-antlered silhouettes, walking on two legs, rustling through the rows of corn under the moon's pale glow. They rarely appear in full sight, as if maintaining the old taboo of not showing themselves openly, but they are there all the same, and every so often at sunrise, I find small tokens on my porch. A few shiny stones, a twisted branch shaped into a figure, or the faint outline of hoofprints near my door. A quiet acknowledgement that our exchange continues. A reminder that, in their eyes, the cycle must never be broken. In the distance, the horizon glows with autumn's promise. Soon the harvest moon will rise again, bathing the fields in ghostly amber. I will do what I must, gather the best of the crops, carry them in a basket to the clearing, and stand vigil in the hush of night. They will come, receive my tribute, and grant me another season of uneasy peace, because I have learned here, in this place, the line between man and beast is blurred by age-old pacts. The Stag's children walk among us, hidden in plain sight, weaving their ancient rhythms into our modern lives. And so long as I remain on this farm, I am bound to them by blood, bone, and fear.